I'd like to welcome you to the Smart Cities Research Institute seminar for the month of September. We are very lucky at the moment to have such a great speaker as Professor Marcus Foth. But at the moment, I'm Jenny Pay, and I'm Program Leader in the Smart Cities Research Institute for the Future Spaces for Living program. So that's about designing the city of the future, the people who live there, and the technologies that they're going to use in their everyday lives at home and at work. So we're looking in all of these areas. So thank you for joining today's webinar on Smart Cities Beyond Fat and Hype, which relates to my research area of looking at future spaces for living. So you're surely going to hear from Marcus Foth from QUT's Design Lab. But before I hand over, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. So I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Kuruna people, which is in Adelaide. But some of you will be in other places around Australia, so I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are also participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this session, so you've agreed to that if you're here. So we invite your comments and questions, and we will have a Q&A session at the end when Marcus has finished talking. There is a Q&A box if you want to put your questions in that. Just type them in there, and at the end we will have a special Q&A session. Alternatively, during the question time, you can raise your hand and we will enable your microphone so that you can speak and verbally ask the question. So if you do ask a question and you don't want that to appear in the official recording, then please email Paul Levy at swinburne.edu.au, giving him the details, and he will remove that part from the recording. But we will distribute this recording to everybody shortly after the session. Now, in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Marcus Foth. You will have read the abstract and his biography as part of the advertising for this event, so I won't sit here reading again. I first heard about Marcus as he was the leading light, I think, in Australia and creating the whole research area of urban informatics. So he is internationally acknowledged in this area, and I think that we're very lucky to have him today. Oh, not yet. And thank you, Marcus, that was great. Question and answers. Okay, so very lucky to have Professor Marcus Foth, who I also count as a personal friend, and he's from QUT's Design Lab, and that's me talking. So Marcus, if you would like to take over the screen, then we can have you doing your talk.
Right, thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you, Mark, and the team at Swinburne for organising this webinar and for having me today. Is this coming through now?
Yes.
Great. I should quickly just check whether I've ticked the boxes for the video. Let me just do this again. Yeah, it did. Okay. All right, so what I've prepared is a presentation in three parts. I'll set a little bit of context. I'm based here in Brisbane. I'm currently also working from home. We are not quite as locked down as Victoria, which is lucky, but at the same time, we are bracing ourselves that any of this could happen here at any moment. And there is quite a nervousness and anxiousness of us watching the news every day and hoping, fingers crossed, that we will eventually manage to get over this crisis. At the same time, I believe that there is very interesting research moments, and so I think what we're also kind of looking at here at QUT is the kinds of opportunities to learn from this experience for cities and for post-pandemic cities. I'd also like to, before I start, add my acknowledgements of our traditional owners. Here in Brisbane, it's the Yagara and Turrbal people on the lands where QUT sits and where I'm based. So I'll give you a little bit of background to our work, and then there's three parts where I'm tracing some of the development in the smart city space, and hopefully there will be some time for Q&A. As Jenny kindly mentioned, we've been working in the space of urban informatics for quite a long time. This was our first sign on the door of our research group space at QUT. And you can see from this illustration that Christine Satchel helped us design with some input from her colleagues back in 2006, that it is supposed to be about the physical and the digital coming together. So there is the physical, the tectonic and the architectural elements, the spatial elements, but at the same time, we were very interested in the digital, in the electronic, in the way that those two layers are coming together. And that has been an interest that we've been continuing ever since. I suppose we were quite early adopters of this hybrid, this binary of the digital and the physical. And we started calling it urban informatics because we felt it was a term that was fitting because it had the technical digital aspects and the urban in the same name. I think these days, if you actually now look at this mushrooming of different research centers that are looking at urban informatics, I feel that their interpretation and definition is slightly different. We have far more of a design orientation, and we have a transdisciplinary orientation to our work, whereas the more recent research centers in urban informatics, especially the American ones, they're actually much more about data. And they follow an urban science approach where data analytics is pretty much the bread and butter of what they do. And so there's a bit of a difference, I suppose, in the interpretation of what we mean by urban informatics. But those are largely semantics. I think all these approaches are valid in their own kind of way. We just like to be a little bit more encompassing and inclusive, which is illustrated by this little Venn diagram. So here you can see the different influences that we've been following, and this is both in terms of our methods and our theory, but also the people that are coming together in our research lab. So we have this kind of credo of people, place, and technology that we're trying to combine in our research group, and that then entails influence from the spatial disciplines, from architecture and planning and urban design, from the technical disciplines such as HCI, computer science, IT, and so forth, but also very much, and especially because we are embedded in the design lab, and that's in turn embedded in the creative industries and humanities area at QUT. We also take in a lot of disciplinary knowledge and theories from the humanities, from communication studies, media studies, and sociology, and so forth. So it's quite an illustrious and interdisciplinary group, and the projects similarly are quite diverse. This is the definition that we started with early on. Here we say that urban informatics is the study, design, and practice of urban experiences across different urban contexts that are created by the new opportunities of real-time ubiquitous technology, and then also the augmentation that mediates physical and digital layers, people networks, and urban infrastructures. It's quite a mouthful, but we are trying to not be too focused on just the data piece, so that more narrow definition. We still do a little bit of that, and I'll show you some examples, but we actually have an interest in some of the more critical approaches to the smart city as well. When you look at this kind of portfolio of some of the research projects, and I'll talk about some of them in more detail, you see there's some data pieces. So we've been doing, for instance, value capture and value uplift scenarios with colleagues at UNSW, funded by the CSC for spatial information. But then there's also quite designerly projects around sustainability, entrepreneurship, questions of gender, urban planning and community engagement, transport and mobility, and so and media architecture. And so that's kind of what interests us. It's really quite a wide scope that is defined by this people, place, technology credo. And more recently, I've set up the QUT Design Lab. So that's our research center now that is a bit more encompassing. It also includes research groups in design robotics. We have people there in humanitarian architecture and in industrial design and in fashion. And they are doing additional research in complementary areas. So the Design Lab is where our work is now based. And urban informatics as a group is part of the QUT Design Lab. So these are the three parts that I quickly wanted to go through. I will briefly mention what might come next after this definition. And you'll see that I'm starting here with what I, in a very kind of computer sciencey type of way, refer to as City 2.0. So where is City 1.0? 1.0 really, in my kind of view of the world, and this is very kind of black and white, is before the technology hype and the interest around smart cities and the digital kind of emerged. So before that happened, and it's kind of difficult to say because technology has always been in cities. We've always had some sort of, technical innovation in cities. So it's very hard to have a very clear cut line, but I'm kind of thinking of the time before 2008, 2009, before the IBM Smarter Planet and Smart City strategy was released, before McKinsey and KPMG and all the others kind of jumped onto that bandwagon. I think the world was a little bit easier because city governments largely saw themselves as the administrator. So when you're a local government, there's this kind of saying about the 3 R's, the roads, rates, and rubbish. And that was also in a way what the residents, people living in cities, associated the city government with. And so this turned a little bit more complicated in this City 2.0 kind of arena when technology entered and when the smart city entered the scene, because all of a sudden a city government was told that, you shouldn't be just thinking of yourself as government and bureaucrats, you actually service providers. And the people living there are consumers of those services. So it became a very corporate kind of agenda and narrative that started to be used, and also the rhetoric used in industry and government changed from the more policy-oriented one to one that was much more commercially oriented. I wrote about these 4 different phases of smart city development in this article that I put down there at the bottom that was published in Smart and Sustainable Built Environment. And I'm happy to share these slides with you. So if you'd like to follow up in any of these references that I'm giving you there. So that was kind of the first phase of smart city research. We were already active in the design and HCI space, looking at what at that time was largely just referred to as urban computing. So before everyone referred to smart cities, we were very interested in technology in the cities as well. And people referred to that as UbiComp, ubiquitous computing. The smart city branding and marketing only really kicked in much later. And I think it actually came also with a whole bunch of problems. And I think by now, those kinds of issues and problems have been discussed in the literature much more prominently than what it was in the early days. So the early days were really characterized by this idea of deploying technology in the city, and that will make everything much better. This is a bit of a archival footage. I actually tried to find it again on YouTube, and I think it's been taken down, but I've got a local copy here that I'm going to try.
The time to make our city smarter is now. But how do you keep traffic flowing? Cure a healthcare system? Protect citizens while protecting their privacy? How do you show one decision affecting millions of people? Become a citizen of the smarter city.
Now, how fantastic is that? Please take my money. So awesome. All this technology that will make all our problems go away. So my kind of cynical view of this is that at the time the global financial crisis happened around 2007, 2008, tech providers and big consultancy firms were looking for new markets and new cash cows. And cities were really it. So it was definitely, we've had even study participants and interviewees from local government that said there was a moment around that time where all of a sudden they were inundated with meeting requests and appointment requests from these guys coming out of the tech world. And they were telling them, just buy our stuff, our gear, our kit, and we can make everything better, whether it is waste management or traffic congestion or whatever have you. And so this early notion of the smart city was really characterized by the shopping list. Now, the shopping list entailed free Wi-Fi. So if you want to be a smart city, you have to have free Wi-Fi. In this case, there's free Wi-Fi at the Botanic Gardens. And the the notion around free Wi-Fi was largely around a symbolic kind of appearance of technology. So whether it's actually useful to have Wi-Fi at this fish pond was secondary to the actual ability to erect these signages that said there's Wi-Fi available. Whether you could actually be quite easily on your mobile phone and use your mobile data didn't really matter. The city had an excuse to erect these signs, and all of a sudden there was some sort of appearance of being digital. The next shopping item is, this is a photo from Canada Bay in Sydney, an early adoption of smart street lights and smart street poles. More recently, those smart street lights have been in the news in Hong Kong because the protesters in Hong Kong have been starting to topple them and rip them down because of the fear of surveillance and prosecution and facial recognition. But in a nutshell, these smart street poles, they have a bunch of fancy technology. There's air quality sensors, there is LED lights, they can be programmed to have different light temperature. They can be motion detection so that the lights are brighter when someone is actually available and present in that vicinity, and then they dim in order to conserve energy. And they have other modules. So they are especially used right now as a technical scaffold for the rollout of 5G, because the 5G cell network has a far smaller cell size and greater density. So those kinds of mobile phone beacons, they actually need to be installed pretty much at every single street light in order to provide the coverage required for that network. Another big fad around the time, I believe, were urban screens. Again, largely driven by cities wanting to look digital, and so digital is largely invisible, but these screens are actually prominent. In the UK, we had the Big Screens program of the BBC, and largely without the adequate programming, they failed because it isn't just about the screen installation and the technology and the hardware. It's also about who's available to curate content and also have a strategy in place that ties in the content with the location where the screen is installed. So most of the time these days, when you see these urban screens, they display free-to-air television, sometimes just ads or sports programs. And there's only some exceptions to the rule where locations have actually identified good content and curation strategies. Obviously, data has been a long time and strategic and significant component in the smart city arena. And that is both about the data that comes from governments making data available through the open data agenda. Then there is a whole bunch of data that comes from our own transactions, whether it's social or commercial. And then there is IoT and data that comes from devices, from sensors, from technology that is embedded. So it's those three categories of open data, social media data, and the personal kinds of transactions, and the third one around IoT data, that the smart city uses as input and raw material in its data analytics efforts. And all of this obviously goes magically into this entity called the cloud, and we'll revisit what that actually means in a bit. So when I look at this kind of these early days of the smart city, what it largely looks like is an engineering and technocratic approach to solving urban problems. And sometimes even I find it a little bit arrogant that the decades of research in architecture, in urban studies, in urban sociology and so forth, like all of those colleagues have just been told, step aside, here comes the engineers, and we're gonna fix the city for you. And some of this is also resonating in the kinds of commentary that is actually very adversarial to this arrival of the smart city as a very technocentric kind of approach to fixing urban problems without much, I suppose, sensitivity or interest in all the kind of research that has been going on in those different urban fields prior to the global financial crisis. So when at the time the media reported on smart cities, they wanted some sort of image, and the poster child, I suppose, of the smart city in those days was the IBM control room in Rio that you see here. At the time, it was heralded as the largest array of screens in South America. You see these operators that get all the data feeds from the city, and it's about, you know, doing a whole bunch of actually useful stuff. Like, for instance, the favelas in Brazil and the favelas in Rio, they were prone to flooding. And so it's about the timely dispatching of emergency services. It was about flood mitigation. It was about waste management, trying to combat crime and so forth. And so there's a lot of really useful stuff in this notion of optimization, of efficiencies, of trying to figure out how we can run the city in a better way. But this is just one side of the coin. I think this top-down approach, it is just looking at the city from above, as you've seen in that IBM video. It's like, you know, the bird's eye view, and we are all little blobs that are just jumping around there and doing our little thing. But from above, it just looks like this this very far away, abstracted and removed perspective. So my question from this kind of first phase of smart city deployment is really, how can we translate this to a more human-centered approach, to one that relates to the needs of people in a more local and more tailored capacity? And that's also when some other even city organizations emerged. This is the Open and Agile Smart Cities Network, is a global network as a community of practice. It was founded by colleagues in Aarhus University in Denmark, but it was largely taken up by cities. So the members of this organization are cities themselves, and the tech vendors are not part of this community of practice, because it is about cities actually exchanging experience and knowledge of how they want to become open and agile. Largely, they were fearing the risk of vendor lock-in, which is when you become an IBM city or you become a Cisco city, and the different technology pieces that you are investing in, they don't talk to each other. So you've got to get the Kool-Aid from your dealership, and you can't easily switch to, you know, another dealership. And so the OASC was very interested in implementing open standards and also different principles around the implementation that would enable different cities to collaborate. And this OASC network has mushroomed and grown. There's lots of members across Europe. It's also jumped across to South America. They have an MOU with another city network in the US that isn't reflected here. And we've introduced the OASC network to Australia, and there's a number of cities in Southeast Queensland that have signed up to this community of practice. So this City 2.0, this initial phase of smart city deployment, it was a little bit of a shopping list. The hype was around open data, but also to start introducing standards in order to then ensure that these technology pieces would be able to talk to each other. So the notion of interoperability. In this next phase, what I would term City 3.0, we started to become more interested in not just the technical layer, but the business and the social and the human layer. So the city government would assume more the role of a facilitator, and people living in cities, those of participants. So there was a recognition around that time that it is actually quite useful to have participatory approaches, both in planning as well as the deployment of cities. I published this little piece in The Conversation that is talking about smart cities should start with people first. And this was in response to Malcolm Turnbull releasing at that time the National Smart City Strategy for Australia, which again was largely driven around investment and grants programs and investing in and deploying and buying gear, kit, tech. Now this will be familiar to many of you. Federation Square, this is the previous screen configuration, and it's a very historic moment. I'm showing this because I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but especially when I talk about smart cities internationally, Federation Square is really a great example. So whilst I've been critical of urban screens in general, I think Federation Square have actually done a really good job of curating content and applications for the screen that has been installed at Fed Square. It's not just, you know, let's switch on channel 9 and put it on repeat. There's actually a lot of thought and effort and money that goes into the screen program at Fed Square. I'm showing you Kevin Rudd's apology to Indigenous Australia because it again represents and symbolizes that cities are more than just consumption. Whilst the corporate world is often telling us that cities are just about spending your hard-earned cash in restaurants and in shopping malls, I think this particular moment of people coming out, not just watching the apology at home on their TV or on their mobile phone, but actually attending this event together as a collective at Federation Square. And then when Rudd was finished and the Speaker of the Opposition came on, and everyone at Fed Square turned around 180 degrees and faced their back to the screen in the symbolic protest, because the leader of the opposition didn't endorse the Australian government's apology to Indigenous Australia. This again just corroborates how civic squares and the civic nature of urban architecture and built environment is just so much more than just consumption. So I think this is just a beautiful example that isn't just about the technology at all. It's actually about the civic merit of our urban environment. We've had the great privilege of working with the Fed Square team for quite a number of years. One of the applications we've developed is called Discussions in Space. This is when Cadell Evans won the Tour de France and he came back to Fed Square and he did his victory parade. And so there's people sending messages onto the screen, either text messages or tweets, and they were animated and displayed on the big screen. We've also extended this work into other forms of situated community engagement. This is our InstaBooth project, which takes some of the Discussions in Space features as a module, but there's other modules that get added into the structure. So it's a kind of deployable scaffold for community engagement in place. There is a mix of digital as well as analog, physical, like paper-based engagement modules that we have installed there as well. And it can be moved to the different places where a local government or an entity wants to engage people. The other nice difference that we found people appreciated is the fact that you can see each other's responses. So rather than the conventional community engagement that is black box, put in your submission and then you don't really see what happens to it, this is actually at the same time a bit of an exhibit. So you see other people's responses, both the digital ones and the physical ones, the hand-drawn ones, and you can engage with each other in this kind of manner. I mentioned the IBM control room, and there is a lot of utility that comes from these control centers. But what I wanted to also explore is how can we give the power and might of the data analytics into the hands of ordinary people. And this was inspired by an installation at QUT. We have this kind of big signature investment in this, I think it's like 2.5 stories tall, this visualization space called the Cube. And you can see that it actually is very accessible. It's open to the public. People can go to it. And so inspired by that approach, we did a study on food trucks, which are gourmet food trucks that seem to be very popular, not just in Brisbane, but in lots of capital cities. And the idea was to take the data analytics capabilities to the food truckies. So we actually stole some of the cows, the computers on wheels, as we call them at QUT. We dragged them across the river, and we, probably in violation of all our insurance policies, set them up outdoors where the food trucks would prepare their food. So this is one of the central commercial kitchens where they, in the afternoon, they all hang out there and they prepare their food in that commercial kitchen and they load up the truck and then they go out into Brisbane and sell their wares. So what we've done here is actually enable them to use data analytics for their specific purposes. So rather than, for instance, having this random serendipitous positioning of food trucks, we wanted them to be able to be more strategic, so that you don't, for instance, get, you know, Italian all next to each other because they didn't talk to each other. So we enabled them to do better planning and better deployment of these trucks. And we also gave them data about the different hotspots in the city, whether it's about construction sites, whether it's about sports events, or whether it's postgraduate students that are studying on campus. Their classes finish at 7 or 8 p.m. and then their dinner is just the food available in a vending machine. So we've did mashups of when the timetables finish on the different campuses, so that the food trucks could be there at the time that large classes of postgrad students are finishing their evening classes, and then they could grab some bite to eat as the campus retailers are shut. So this more participatory approach in this City 3.0 phase, we've been pushing for a lot of citizen participation. I didn't go much into procurement reform, but that has been quite an interest around that time as well, which is how these projects actually get set up at the city level, and the notion of open innovation and how the citizen participation can actually be used to drive innovation, to come up with new use cases and use scenarios with the tech providers and vendors. And then the final phase, and it's probably not the final, but the last one I'm gonna talk about in more detail, is City 4.0. So this is where we get a much more eye-level relationship between city government and people. So the city government would actually assume the role of a collaborator, and the notion of residents are not just about participation, but actually able to take agency and their own autonomy in their hands and become co-creators. If you are as old as me, you might remember this cover on Time magazine, where you, as in the participatory web, the Web 2.0, which is a very old term, was on the cover in 2006, and it was to symbolize this new kind of approach and culture, the participatory culture of the web. What I'm thinking here is that we actually need to consider what the we is, the collective one, because that's actually what we see unfold in cities in so many ways, whether it's in the good or the bad times, whether it's about the protests in Hong Kong or whether it's about the coronavirus crisis that we are dealing with right now. And this is obviously also something that a lot of urban practitioners and people in community engagement and planning and strategy and design have been thinking about. For instance, this IAP2 Spectrum, the International Association for Public Participation, they've been categorizing the different levels of engagement. They are saying we need to push more towards collaborate and empower. And sometimes that just is reduced to tokenism and co-optation, where it actually is largely engagement theater rather than genuine engagement. So there is a lot of work to be done. What I'm going to give you a glimpse of is a project more recently that we've started that we call Data Care. One component of that Data Care program of research was looking at contrasting the Sidewalk Lab Smart City in Toronto, which by now actually has been cancelled largely. So there has been an announcement a couple of weeks ago that Alphabet company, the Google holding company that owns Sidewalk Labs, they are retreating from Toronto. The Toronto waterfront development will not proceed, and they're looking for other kinds of avenues to do this once the COVID-19 crisis is over. But in this particular project, we looked at the kinds of challenges that this smart city deployment is facing in Canada, and we compared it with the same kind of push for smart cities in Barcelona in Spain. And what's been quite interesting is it's not so much about the technical infrastructure or any piece of technology, it's actually about the data and the notion of the technological sovereignty, that there is a lot of risk and downsides in the governance of a city being jeopardized and the civic autonomy of a city being jeopardized if some of the governance arrangements are largely done in the cloud, but the cloud is actually an a proprietary infrastructure that is owned by a multinational corporation. So it wasn't just about the backlash from the citizens and the residents of Toronto. Obviously, they had concerns about privacy, they had concerns about surveillance. What we found was quite interesting in that the city itself and some of the elected representatives at that local government, they were concerned that all of a sudden the city wouldn't be able to do its job anymore. The city was actually facing governance risks in the sense that its ability to have its own civic sovereignty could have been jeopardized by some of the proposals that were put forward. And so in this article, we are contrasting this with the notion of technological sovereignty that has been championed by Barcelona. So I'll recommend this to you as I think an interesting kind of take on the smart city agenda and how the social license to operate comes in. On the basis of that article, we've been collaborating with ThoughtWorks and with Frontier SI and with the Consumer Policy Research Center that's actually based in Melbourne. And we came up with this vision for data care, which is our kind of approach to try and engage both citizens, businesses, but also the city officials in a collaborative project around smart city data. And so you can see here our premise is for data care to be a dedicated facility. So it's an actual space in the city, set up in the city, that is offered by the city to citizens, communities, businesses. And then the data care facility would allow different configurations. So I'm going to show you these 4 configurations that we've been coming up with. There is the data awareness configuration. So this is kind of like a triage configuration. So you can think of it maybe as a living lab. In this first configuration, it's about being able to respond to citizens, businesses having concerns about data or having questions about data. So you actually get paired up with an expert that can give you more hints and more awareness around what actually is going on. That might then lead to a second phase, which is the data literacy configuration, which is where we run workshops and classes. So I think the first 2 are pretty straightforward. Similar things happen from a digital literacy point of view in many libraries. And in our discussions with cities, they actually suggested that libraries might actually be the hosts, the venues where the data care facility could be easily set up. I think the third and the fourth configuration is really quite interesting. So the data action one is where groups of citizens, community associations, different businesses can hire the facility in order to do their own data analytics. So if you think of that food truck example that I showed you earlier, it's actually doing this on a more regular basis. So you can book the space, you get paired up with data scientists and visualization people, and you might workshop through a particular problem. So it could be, we've been exercising this scenario of a local cycling group. The cycling group wants to advocate for a new green bridge over the Brisbane River, but they face a lot of backlash from the casino operator because the casino operator doesn't like cyclists. The casino operator likes the bridge to go straight into the pokie room. So the pedestrians that come over from South Bank, they go straight to level 5, straight into the pokie room, and you can go straight into the retail empire. Now, cyclists can't do that because they are on a bike, and so that would be a conflict, and so the casino operator is very much against it. So the local cycling group hires the data care facility to mount an argument around data, to boost their advocacy. And so rather than being just exposed to the might of money, where, big casino operator that has so much money to spend, obviously they're hiring all sorts of experts to make an argument to the city. And then you as an average cyclist are just exposed to that level of bedazzlement. What we want to do is elevate and empower other groups of the city to have the level of data advocacy that these more commercial and corporate groups are already using. And then the final one, the data futures one, is a bit of a Black Mirror kind of speculative futures configuration of that data care facility. So usually when you get a new solution that a company proposes to the city, everything is hunky-dory, everything is blue skies, everything is sunny. The scenarios from a design point of view are usually very positive, because obviously they want to sell that particular product or service. So the scenarios that are being offered in their marketing rhetoric are very good, very positive, everything works well. What we want to do with Data Futures is to configure this space so that you actually have an ability to go through a whole spectrum of possibilities, not just the best optimal and optimistic and utopian one, but also the one that looks at some of the downsides, so that the city, when it wants to make an investment decision, it is also aware of the policy implications and the regulatory implications of what might go wrong and what can we do about it in order to balance those different forces. It was just a very quick snapshot. I'm putting this up because in that book chapter, we are talking about the data care vision in more detail. It's called From Automation to Autonomy, Technological Sovereignty for Better Data Care in Smart Cities. And that's available on that ePrints link that I'll share with you. So this 4.0 level, citizens are actually now elevated much more on a par as co-creators. A lot of the attention in innovation isn't about tech innovation, it's actually about policy reform and policy innovation. And I think a lot of attention on data care. Similarly, the Smart Cities Council for Australia and New Zealand has been pushing for a data leadership institute. And so some of the, I think the objectives and aims that we are pushing for, Adam Back and the Smart Cities Institute are also following with the Data Leadership Institute that the Smart Cities Council have set up. And I'll just kind of finish on this question of, what is City 5.0? Now, we've been starting to think about this as well. That's its own talk, I suppose. So I'm not going to go into much detail. But one of my hobbies is beekeeping. This is me on my rooftop. It's actually just right above me. And so as part of this engagement with nature, but I think it's also, becoming far more urgent when we're looking at the COVID-19 situation. We have to have a much more genuine consideration of sustainability. And so what I'm kind of looking at as City 5.0 is how we can have a more than human approach to cities. And so this is actually about looking at the problems and downsides of following a human-centered approach. Human-centeredness always sounds very great, but in effect, it causes a lot of shortcuts. So human-centeredness is often in the commercial world translated into human convenience and human comfort. And human convenience and comfort that can sell things, it sells your products and services, but convenience and comfort isn't always good for the planet. And so if we think of human-centeredness, we actually got to acknowledge that we are not the only ones here on Earth. And some of our design decisions need to account for our entanglement with the ecosystem. We actually have to embrace a more than human design approach to cater for both our well-being as well as the planet's well-being. This is an article that my colleague Lena Caldwell did for the Media Architecture Biennale, where we look at media architecture from a more than human point of view. And you see these fig trees that are super popular in Brisbane. I think you have these fairy lights in Melbourne maybe as well. They are popping up everywhere. Every tree that is big enough and in some prominent place, it all gets wrapped up in bloody fairy lights. It's quite a nuisance. You think it's very magical and beautiful, but it actually renders that habitat completely unusable for wildlife. So urban wildlife like nocturnal animals, arboreal animals, possums, tawny frogmouths, other kinds of critters and creatures cannot live being entangled in fairy lights. It's both a risk of their safety, but it's also a problem of the brightness. So the light pollution is problematic as well. We've been looking at some of the methods for more than human participation in this workshop where we assumed the roles of more than humans in the city of Genk in Belgium as part of the Participatory Design Conference. And we've also been writing about this in the Journal of Urban Technology. We are talking about post-anthropocentric cities and how we need to embrace this more than human notion to evade urban ecocides. And finally, in the Architectural Science Review, where we've been critiquing and evaluating the kind of green building frameworks, the LEEDS one, the Australian version of the Green Building Council, and the Living Building Challenge. And we've contrasted this with what we actually have to achieve when we take the requirements and the imperative of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change seriously. And there's actually quite a gap. So these incremental efficiency improvements that you see there on the left, they're not going to cut it. It's just not good enough. The overall trajectory for our building footprint is still up, and it's still exponential upward trend of our carbon footprint in the built environment. And so as long as we have this greenwashing, where buildings are 5 and 6 stars, but they don't actually achieve a net positive reduction in their carbon footprint, we're not going to actually do our job in the built environment. I'm also doing a plug for my colleague, Ron Wakari. Is a professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver in Canada. And he's just finished his manuscript that he sent to MIT Press for this new book that's called Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds. And so I strongly recommend, this is not going to come out until next year, but if you ask Ron nicely, you might be able to get a preprint copy and engage in some of his thinking and some of his thought leadership in that space. And hopefully I've left, I raced through this enough time for some questions, but that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'm really interested to see how this resonates with everyone. So thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. That was excellent. I think we could say there was something for everyone in that talk. You covered a lot of different aspects of the smart city, and a lot of people's different interest areas must have come into that. And definitely some little provocations in there to rethink some of the stuff that we take for granted. So really excellent talk. Okay, I have 2 questions. They're both from Brody, who's a student of mine. So, hey Marcus, do you find as we move towards a progressively more integrated society that citizens will be more concerned for their personal privacy? Where is the line between seamless interaction and being able to opt out?
The privacy discussion is evolving, and it's quite complex. So it's very the question is really good, and I would have a lot to say about it, but it would take up far more time. I would definitely say that what's been quite interesting is we've done some work on the contact tracing apps for COVID-19 and the privacy implications. And so what I think started all of this is the kind of conundrum that there's so many people on TikTok, on Snapchat, on Facebook, and there is a lot of privacy risks and privacy challenges with those commercial platforms. Yet when our government comes up with the COVID Safe app, there is far more backlash. And so I think sometimes the actual history of not trusting this government because of the history of what they've done so far has more bearing on privacy considerations than the actual evidence on the table. So I think what would have been really useful for Australia to embrace more technical means of contact tracing is to actually go with the privacy preserving framework that was proposed by Google and Apple in collaboration. And that was rejected by our government in favor of their centralized approach that doesn't have the same privacy protections. And so as a result, I think the uptake of that has been beyond the requirement and expectations. But yeah, Brody, if you're interested in privacy specifically, I can share a separate article that deals with that in more detail.
Okay, just reminding everyone, I've got to reiterate, you can either type into the Q&A thing, which is at the bottom of your screen, or if you raise your hand, we can also get you to ask the question with your voice. Okay, there's another question here, Marcus, from Danny Fan. Marcus, what metrics would you use to evaluate the success of an urban informatics project?
Well, I suppose it depends what the project is about. There's always ways to evaluate something on the basis of how you get paid or funded. So for instance, you can set up an evaluation in a commercial context where you say, this was the design brief that I was given. My design brief was to disrupt the taxi industry, and so I've designed Uber. And so if you then say my expectations have been fulfilled, you would give yourself a pat on the shoulder and say, yep, I fulfilled my goal. But I think from a more holistic point of view, you might want to consider whether the ethics have been factored into the evaluation of what you've done there. So if you look at it from the point of view of the gig economy, of worker precarity, of the employment conditions, of the fact that we are actually now competing with public transport. There's, the fares and the pool sharing feature that is now not competing with taxis anymore. It's actually competing with public transport. And so this is everyone's investment as taxpayers that is being jeopardized in pushing more people into single or double occupancy cars. So from a transport management and transport planning point of view, it's completely flabbergasting that policy is still lagging behind and letting our investment in Australia and other countries in public transport be jeopardized in this way. So I think one recommendation I have with regards to that is a book by Mike Montero that is called Ruined by Design. I'll just put the link up in my answer to this question. That might go to everyone if I do this. Yeah, hopefully this will go through. So have a look at Mike's book, Ruined by Design. It's independently published, and you can get it on the web on that link.
Okay, Paul Lavey, can you let Mark Burry talk? Can you undo his microphone? Yep. Okay, Mark, you've got a question.
Oh, thanks, Mark. That was very enlightening and enlivening. In terms of impact on urban policy and urban design, if we took Barcelona as a 9 out of a scale of 0 to 10, in terms of that relationship between people like yourself and your colleagues and the effect it has on decision making, where would you put Brisbane? And do you have a sense of how the other cities are doing?
If Barcelona is, I would agree that Barcelona I would rate quite high because they actually have an appetite to not just go with the flow of commercial deployments, but really think through implications and innovate not just on the technical space, but innovate on the regulatory, on the process, on the policy space. I think that Brisbane isn't quite there yet. Our local government self-admittedly is very risk averse. They constantly say that themselves. They are the largest local government in Australia, whilst Melbourne and Sydney have more people. Brisbane City Council is all amalgamated. So we got a local government that has nearly the budget of Tasmania. It is very, well, I think relatively speaking, slow moving. And one of the kinds of things that they have done in the past is create the equivalency of special purpose vehicles. Like for instance, some years ago, in order to meet some of the sustainability goals and KPIs, they created their own company. And so they realized that if they were to do this in-house as its own local government entity, it would be too slow and too convoluted. And so they outsourced sustainability to CitySmart, which is a wholly owned subsidiary entity that is owned by the local government, but they have their own board and CEO and directors and ways of getting things done. So that was kind of one way of dealing with it. I think though, in terms of a ranking, I don't believe much in these rankings. I hope that eventually we'll get to, something that is as progressive as what we see in Barcelona.
No, I wasn't really going for ranking. I was just sort of degree of effectiveness. Melbourne's got 32, I think, local governments, all with their own individual smart city frameworks and policies, and it means that it's very difficult to get any traction other than on a sort of spot fire basis. So I just wanted to know what's different in Brisbane. I wasn't really ranking.
Okay, it is different in that regard, because if Brisbane does want to do something and they launch it, they can do it with a lot of support and investment. Like, for instance, it was probably a very top-down decision, at least that's how it comes across, to decide, but we're going to do something about the Victoria Park golf course. I don't know if that has kind of featured down in Victoria, but there is a plan of creating a Manhattan Central Park caliber parkland for the city of Brisbane that is based on a golf course in Victoria Park in Kelvin Grove. So I think if it wasn't amalgamated and as big as it is, that would be a very difficult thing even just to contemplate. Whereas Brisbane can just say, okay, we're going to do it. And so then there's a lot of, once that heavy train gets in motion, it kind of, it's slow moving, but once it's in motion, it's very hard to stop.
Okay, I have one last question here from Akil Farouk. What can be suggested ethical recommendations to remain cost effective while using Industry 4.0 protocols? So I guess, how do we use,
So again, it's a very, it's a good question, but it would require quite a long answer. So everything that is under that Industry 4.0 banner, whether it's, automation, whether it's data analytics, whether it's robots, it I think often is seen as being useful in a commercial sense. It's good for efficiencies, optimization, all this kind of language that we find in management and in the corporate world. But I think what we got to consider when we do look at those kinds of things is, well, what happens to the things outside that commercial bubble, that kind of profit and efficiency bubble. What I find quite interesting, again, referring back to that earlier reference about Mike Montero's book, there is a question around a union. And Silicon Valley has been grappling with this for a number of years around, do we have a union for actually not just getting people that are working in that space together? It's in this case not predominantly focusing on pay rise. It's actually about the ethical discussion, right? So what a union also does in other industries, it's looking at safety concerns. It's also looking at ethical practices. And it's not just always about protesting for enterprise bargaining and pay rises. I think what is missing in design, in the space of tech workers, in the space of gig economy workers, freelancers, they're all individual butterflies, which is fantastic to be agile and to be independent. But I think we might need to consider what is the equivalency of a union, where if you are, as a worker, as a designer, as a tech expert, you get exposed to these unethical practices. How can you find a collective to have peer support and to actually have another sounding board? Because otherwise, you don't really have the critical mass to back you up as a kind of social safety net for these kinds of concerns. And I think that is largely missing in the space that we are dealing with.
Thank you, Marcus, for a wonderful talk. I think we'll finish it there because we don't want to run over time. I know people probably have somewhere else to be, but that was really enlightening. I'll remind everyone that this is being recorded, so you will be able to get access to the recording afterwards. The last thing I'd just like to say, if you would like, I'll just leave it on that mode. If you would like to learn more about the Smart Cities Research Institute, anything we do, you've had Marcus's information on the earlier slide. This is the information on how to contact us, or we have a website that you can go and visit and look at the different projects we're there. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you, Marcus, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And it's lovely to meet you and see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm sure everyone will clap out loud if they were allowed to have their microphones on.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you.